Good morning. Let me add my words of welcome, and can I thank you all for coming. I think this is the only session being held this week where none of the speakers have put an abstract in the programme, so I think you're all showing an element of trust to be here, which is a positive start to the day. Now, a lot of you probably, like me, enjoyed the hospitality of our Yorkshire hosts last night, so I thought we'd get you warmed up this morning with a little quiz. This is going to involve you raising your arms in the air rather than anything more. Can I ask, first of all, whether any of you saw the results of this survey that was published 2 or 3 weeks ago by the European Union that was measuring trust in statistics across all of the member states? Did any of you see this survey? In a sense, well, part of me is horrified that none of you have seen it because it's quite important. But on the other hand, it does mean you can all take part in the quiz. So let's look on the on the bright side. So it's going to work like this. I'm going to give you the name of a country, and you're going to tell me whether this country is in the top third, the middle third, or the bottom third of European countries for having trustworthy data according to the people in that country that were polled. The question, I suppose I ought to give that to you, the exact question, given the nature of the audience, is question was, quote, how much trust do you have in official statistics? And people then had a range of answers. And I've lumped together all those that were basically positive. Those people had a lot of trust or a fair amount of trust and so forth. Okay, first country is Hungary. Now, this is the country where you might recall a couple of years ago the Prime Minister was caught on a secret recording saying that they'd lied night and day to the population throughout their entire tenure about the economic success of the country. So, with that little bit of information, can I ask how many of you... Perhaps, but let's see. How many of you would put the Hungarians in the top third of European countries for trust? Okay, and how many in the middle third? Okay, and how many in the bottom third? I just wish I had a prize, because you deserve it. Yeah, the Hungarians had no trust in their government statistics. They came 26th out of, I think, the 28 countries that were surveyed. Second country, Netherlands. I've chosen them because, for me, on the continent, they're the country that's sort of most like the Brits, I think. They're the only European country that has a sense of humour, and they have a rather sort of cynical, sceptical attitude to life. So how many of you would put the Netherlands in the top third of European countries? Okay, and how many in the middle third? And how many in the bottom third? Great. Well, most of you got it right there because they're actually the top country across the whole of Europe for confidence. Third country is Greece. Now, Greece, you might recall, a bit like Hungary, also has a little bit of form on bending numbers. 2 or 3 years ago, they were caught just totally fiddling their public finance figures in order to avoid EU sanctions. So again, that might be a steer, or it might not be. How many of you would put Greece in the top third? And in the middle third? And in the bottom third? Okay, well, a fair number of you got that right. They're actually in the middle. They were 12th out of the 28. Now, last bit of interaction is the UK, of course. Now, we're a wee bit sceptical as well. We even have conferences on the topic of trust. But on the other hand, those of you who saw Jack Straw yesterday will realise that 7 years ago we introduced an independent statistical system, ticked off the achieved box on the 97 manifesto, and we've had the system running for 7 years. So how many of you would put the UK in the top third? And the middle third? And the bottom third? Well, yeah, the majority of you have got it. Yeah, Britain did come 28th out of the 28 countries. So, yeah, we've got the sad result that only 33% of Britons tended to trust the data, and that was the lowest in Europe. To be slightly fair, some of the other large countries, France, Germany and Italy, they also had fairly low figures. The average score for those three countries was 40%. But there were many countries with much higher figures. The Dutch scored 77%, and the Irish, which arguably are similar to us, they scored 57%. I think this low level of trust is important because the survey also asked people what they thought the data was used for. And 62% of Europeans and 65% of Brits did think that the data played an important role in business and public decision making. So in that sense, the gap between our levels of trust and what we perceive to be the importance of the data is the greatest in Europe, and that is probably more important than the fact that lots of us don't trust it. So, the question is, how did we get to this situation? Now, I don't think there's any one single reason, but when I started listing them, I found they ended up bunching into three categories. You've got problems with the numbers themselves, you've got problems with what people do with the numbers, and then you've got a range of management issues. What I'd like to do is just run through some examples from each of these categories to give you a flavour of the nature of the problem. First of all, under the category of numbers, one problem here is data that are just not collected. Now, where you've got a lack of data, you end up with bad policy, bad journalism, and prejudice can flourish. One example would be house prices. I think the failure of the public sector to produce a decent index, despite having a department charged with doing it, despite having the land registry, and despite having effective control over what solicitors and the conveyancers put on the forms, is something that's quite extraordinary. Another example would be immigration. A decade ago, the numbers started to rise sharply, and despite its evident importance for public policy and in the minds of the population, we're still left with the wholly inadequate international passenger survey. What have the statisticians and the civil servants done? You know, they've got a bunch of departments together to promise some change in the future. On health, I'm still amazed that we have a vital public service with an industry spending over £100 billion a year, and yet with so little data measuring its performance. Even on waiting lists, that you remember was in 97 election, there was a little credit card-sized piece of paper with 5 pledges on it from Labour. One of those was about waiting lists. Despite that, despite the prominence of these figures, it took a decade to get an estimate of the waiting time from GP to treatment, rather than simply the inpatient waiting list, which is the little bit at the end. A second problem with numbers is what we might call mistakes. The average earnings index was nearly a decade. The problem with the average earnings index was nearly a decade ago, but I think it still resonates with people because it did manage to upset the Treasury and the bank, who are really the two principal clients of the ONS. We had the 2001 population census, which showed a large number of, especially young men, seemed to be missing. The structure of the population of the country altered so much between 91 and 2001 that it just seemed implausible. We were told that all these young men had gone abroad. This, for me, just failed a credibility test. I just think these young blokes didn't want to fill in the forms. As simple as that. Some minor revisions were finally forthcoming 2-3 years later, but it was a bit too little, a bit too late. On pensions, now admittedly it took two brains David Willits to spot this, but it did appear there were double counting of figures running into billions of pounds. And the Pensions Commission, chaired by Adair Turner, was scathing about the quality of the pensions data. A third problem with data is what we might call misleading numbers. Now, a good example here, and those of you who've heard me speak before will know this is one of my little hobby horses, is the New Deal. This was the £5 billion flagship scheme from 1997 to take young people off the dole and into work. Now, because it was a centrepiece of Labour's policy for their first 2 terms, this had to succeed. And if it didn't succeed, it at least had to appear to succeed. Now, the scheme was crafted in such a way that it has become almost impossible to be long-term, that is, over 6 months, unemployed youth. Now, for those of you not familiar with the wheeze, it goes like this. If you happen to be young and unemployed, after 6 months you get called up to go into the New Deal. You go on the scheme of training or job experience, and then the idea is you get a job at the end of it. If you don't, you go back on to benefits. After 6 months, you go back on the New Deal, get some more training, job experience, back onto benefits, and so forth. Now, the trick is that each time you go back onto benefits, you count as a new claimant rather than a continuing claimant. This means that very, very few people are unemployed any longer for more than 6 months. And certainly hardly anyone is unemployed for longer than 12 months because they just haven't been able to dodge the authorities tracking them down for participation in the New Deal. Now, these figures are produced unquestioningly from the administrative system and published by the ONS as national statistics with that stamp of authority on it. Accordingly, long-term youth unemployment, which for those who were brought up with some basic economic statistics some years ago at university, used to be a key series for measuring the health of the economy. Long-term unemployment's disappeared, statistically at least. Are these figures a fair reflection of how many youngsters haven't worked? Of course they're not. Now, Jack Straw was keen yesterday, for those who saw him, to mention, I think he mentioned it 3 times, the changes to the claimant unemployment in the 1980s. I actually think this fiddling with the New Deal is arguably worse than that, because I think it's got an element of premeditation about it. Another example of misleading numbers could be public sector productivity. Now, I'm not sure where this Atkinson review came from. It seems it was a request from number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. But it has led to a large group of people in the ONS producing numbers that might be at the sort of cutting edge of statistical technology, but they've got a very limited following in the wider world. And frankly, they're unlikely to be adopted here or in any other country for many years. A third example where I think statisticians probably left their common sense at home relates to the saga of parliamentary constituency unemployment rates. The House of Commons has produced for years a series of figures using the number of people using the number of people unemployed who are living in the constituency as the numerator, and the number of economically active residents in the constituency as the denominator. In other words, the perfectly normal unemployment rate. The ONS then started producing a variant of this, using the same numerator but a different denominator, namely the number of jobs in the constituency. You could, from that moment, choose 2 different unemployment rates for your parliamentary constituency, and the 2 numbers are often very different. Most extreme difference at the time when the figures were published was for Birmingham Ladywood, an inner-city Birmingham constituency. On the old measure, the proper measure of unemployment, the figure was 18%, shockingly high. On the new measure, because there's lots of in-commuters come into the area, unemployment magically fell to 4%. And there's never been, to my knowledge, a decent explanation as to why this figure was conjured up. It is since withdrawn, it has to be said. But no doubt the Treasury and the then Department for Education and Employment were pressing for it and were delighted that within a couple of years of New Labour coming in, inner city unemployment had apparently been cured. A fourth problem with the numbers is what we might call a lack of reconciliation between different data series. I think this is quite an important issue because it helps to create uncertainty in the minds of the media. A good example is a new weekly earnings series, which is currently showing wages growth at roughly 1% higher than the rate of growth shown in the average earnings index for the private sector earnings. Bank of England is desperately waiting for a reconciliation from the ONS, but hasn't had it yet. And clearly 1% higher wages growth alters the outlook for inflation considerably. A second example, I think, is the Education Department, where everybody, and I think the Stats Commission have asked for this and haven't had it yet, is a reconciliation of the various measures of exam performance to try and get a handle on what is really happening to the performance of pupils in this country. In other words, extracting whatever the grade inflation might be in the public exams. The failure to deliver that, I think, was just compounded by Britain missing from the last round of the PISA survey, which is an international comparison amongst OECD countries of educational performance. Britain was missing because the OECD deemed that our sampling of schools was insufficiently robust. A third example of lack of reconciliation is the figures for the killed and seriously injured people in road accidents. And you've got two options here. You can either believe the figures collected by the police. When the police turn up on an accident, they've got a clipboard. They sort of count the number of people who are killed or seriously injured. The police add all these numbers up. Net result of that across the country is in the last decade, the number of killed and seriously injured has fallen by 40% since Labour came in. The government had set a target to reduce the number of killed and seriously injured by 40% over 10 years, incidentally. Alternatively, you could believe the figures collected by the NHS. Now, here you've also got someone with a clipboard and a pencil. They're standing in at the A&E department, and when the ambulance brings people in, they presumably say, why is this person here? And they say road accident, so they tick whether count how many are killed, how many are seriously injured. What's interesting about those figures, they're stable over the last decade, unchecked. Now, this is important because it might well mean, if you believe the NHS figures, that all the road safety initiatives from the last 10 or 15 years haven't actually delivered any extra safety on our roads. Final example I'll give you from numbers is that of the public-private classifications. I won't dwell on this, it's a complex issue, but the sooner the ONS ceases to be seen as the Treasury's partner in trying to get what are ostensibly public sector bodies classified to the public sector to suit the Treasury's bookkeeping, I think the better it will be for all of us. The second category of problems that I mentioned is what actually happens to the data once the data are released. The first problem here is what I call poor dissemination or weak communication. ONS press releases tend to be dull, websites are hard to navigate, all the departments have their own ways of doing things, making it hard for us users. Some departments let the press speak to the statisticians, others don't. The statistician's stance, I think, is often rather defensive. They're almost sort of apologetic sometimes for releasing new data, which, again, doesn't inspire confidence. I think when you've got statisticians being a little weak, it allows the second problem with dissemination to take hold, and that's the spin and the leaking of data. Legislation is going through Parliament, as Jack Straw mentioned yesterday, which will enshrine this in law. He might not do it, but his officials might do it on his behalf, and certainly I've had first-hand experience of officials in many departments doing it. Departments do release data in ministerial releases at 9:30, and the raw data lying behind it is often not available until after lunchtime that day. By then, the agenda for the story has been set. Third problem with data when it's out and about is the misuse of data. Now, it's always the fault of the press, this, and certainly if you look on the ONS website, it's bulging with letters that national statisticians have sent complaining to editors of newspapers. Most of the time, I actually think it's the third-party fault of this. There was a very good example a couple of weeks ago when a children's charity regurgitated some data that had been published months and years before, compiled it in a misleading way with some feisty quotes and issued it to the press. Papers don't have time to re-research this. If it comes from a respectable body, it tends to get published. Yet it's the newspapers that get this in the neck. The sooner statisticians start complaining about ministerial use of numbers and third-party use of numbers, the press will happily write those stories up. My final thought on the use of data is targets and target setting. I think we all know enough about that I needn't go into the details. The final problem that there is with data is management. This isn't really for me to worry about. This is really what the legislation is designed to solve. But it's very clear to me that we need decent priority setting. We need finances to be open and clear. And also, I think that the relocation of the ONS to Newport needs to be rethought by the Statistics Board. Where does this leave us for the future? Well, the next two presentations will make it easier for you to judge. What I hope I've shown is that this trust is multifaceted, and if it is going to be earned, action is going to be required on many fronts. So I think the new chair of the board has got a big job, he's got an important job, and I wish him well. He's paid comfortably over £1,000 a day, but I think it'll be good value for money if he manages to solve some of these problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Now, let's see if I can get this presentation to work. Great, right. Okay. Well, I think the title is fairly self-explanatory. I want to make, Richard gave me, implied I'd done an awful lot of things, probably more than I actually have. I've consulted for some of these organisations. I haven't actually worked for all of them, but thanks for that. I want to make one point clear before I start, and that is that I've set on the Statistics User Forum. This is obviously something I'm doing in my spare time. So if I can't answer any of your questions at the end, please bear with me. I think I should start, since I'm representing the Statistics User Forum today, by talking about what it is, in case some of you haven't come across it. And essentially, it's an umbrella organisation for groups of statistical users who are using, in general, official statistics, sometimes obviously others as well. It was established in 2004, but it was building on the previous organisation that, in a sense, carried out this role, the Statistics User Council. And it has at the moment over 20 member groups, plus a number of other groups, such as the CBI, who sit as observers. So, for example, among its members, it has the Health Statistics User Group, the Gender Statistics User Group, Demographic Statistics, and so forth. And my own organisation, the Society of Business Economists. So one of its aims is to encourage user groups to form and flourish. And importantly, its view is also to coordinate user views, because obviously users of official statistics are a very diverse group, on overarching issues. And of course, one of the most important overarching issues that we've had in the last year or so has been the prospect of the new legislation. It also establishes general user priorities. So, for example, we have 5 major priorities, including things like, say, coherent statistics across the UK, access, better income statistics, and so forth. So, priorities that the user community as a whole agree are important and should therefore drive statistical policy. We have established regular meetings with the national statistician and her senior staff. Now, user groups, of course, for many years have had a lot of interaction with official statisticians, but that's been in general at a working level. What's been missing is user input at the strategic level. Clearly, there's a limit to how far one can go at the moment, given that we are where we are with the legislation, with the new legislation, and the fact that there will be a completely new system set up as from probably April next year. But in the interim, we meet about 3 times a year with Karen Dunnell and her senior staff, just to show that we're making some progress in that area. And then, of course, we have annual conferences. The annual Statistics User Conference is very well established and well attended, and then seminars and meetings. We were actually established formally by the Royal Statistical Society, and it is the RSS which supplies the Secretariat and hosts and supports us to some supports us, including, I think, a bit financially as well. The organisation also does generate a little bit of its own revenue, but at the moment we also have some quite significant funding from the ESRC. User can mean a range of things. Well, we all know the problems with classifications, but I've been rash enough to develop my own classification of users here. And I tend to think of users of official statistics outside central government as in 3 groups. The first is what I would call professional users, and I imagine, to the extent that you all use official statistics, you would all count as professional users, people who actually do this for a living, usually understand something about the data. And then there are indirect users. These may well be, in a lot of cases, the people for whom you work, people who do use data in their professional life, but not so much directly. And finally, the lay user, the ordinary person, who doesn't use statistics that much, but does occasionally want to find out, look at school league tables, is concerned about hospital waiting lists, or is very worried about crime. By definition, that's a difficult constituency to canvass or represent. The Statistics User Forum clearly represents mainly the people in the top of my 3 categories, with, I think, some of the indirect users as well. Although we do have organisations such as the librarians who interact with the lay users, and that's quite a useful thing. So we don't represent all users, but we do represent quite a large chunk, and I think more than any other group. Simon talked at length about problems of trust, and Richard will, I'm sure, talk about the ONS surveys on it. But I just want to summarise what the latest ONS survey, which I think was in March 2005, found on trust. So the first question, if we look at what people felt as to the accuracy of official statistics, that gels with what Simon was saying about the EU, that it's just over a third who believe they're genuinely accurate. I do think, though, some of Simon's results are probably because we are by nature a much more sceptical country than some others, and have, I think, quite a proper distrust of government, but that's my personal view. I think it's a good thing for a democracy. However, be that as it may, clearly the much bigger problem is of how statistics are perceived to be used, and the issue of whether government interferes, because as you see, the scores there are much worse. And then the final point, I think again, this echoes things I've come across. ONS is trusted more than other government departments. Now, the ONS, when they wrote up this survey, is honest enough to say that people responding did know this was an ONS survey, so this might have biased the results, but it does gel with other things one comes across. At a similar time to this, MORI carried out a survey of opinion formers for the Statistics Commission. I hope I'm summarising this correctly, Richard. It's a very comprehensive and detailed report. Clearly, these were in-depth interviews, so they come out with rather more subtlety, I think, than the ONS survey. But they are from opinion formers, which is a very narrow group. Now, they believe that the quality of UK statistics is among the highest in the world, which is a little different to the general perception. But they do see problems with politicisation, the problems of performance targets, coverage, time lags, the presentation particularly spin at the moment by the government, but also sometimes perhaps presentation that isn't quite as as clever as it could be by official statisticians. Revisions and slowness in responding to complaints. I think a lot of those were actually points that were elaborated by Simon. So we come on to the new legislation. This is now in its final stages of its parliamentary process. It's been through the Commons, through the Lords, and is now just in the process where it's pushed back between the two houses until they finally agree on the wording. I was absolutely delighted to learn that this process is officially called ping pong. So we've got a session on the new legislation later, and I don't want to front run that. But just to summarise, the aim clearly is to make statistics more independent of ministers. And I think from the previous slides you can see why that is so. The ONS is to become a non-ministerial department, and there will be a new statistics board which will have a dual role. It will be the ONS board in the way that any commercial organisation or indeed non-ministerial department has to have a board, but its bigger role is to monitor and, in a sense, oversee all official statistics. There will be a code of practice drawn up. There is, of course, already a code of practice, but this will be revised and enhanced and to be established, and national statistics will be assessed against that code. There'll be a new post of head of assessment who will be responsible for this to the board, as well as the national statistician. As I said, the board will look at all official statistics, and it will report regularly to Parliament, and Parliament will oversee the system. The bill also has other good things, but the potential for greater use of administrative data, and because of the new arrangements, the Statistics Commission will be abolished. Now, is this going to be positive or negative for trust? Now, I'm starting with an assessment that one of my fellow members on the SUF did by going through the bill clause by clause and marking whether he felt it was positive, neutral or negative for trust. That's Ulrich Spencer, for those of you who may know him. He told me he was feeling kind when he did this, but I know he's a sceptical person anyway. So he found that 38 clauses were positive, including 4 that he deemed critical, 25 clauses neutral, and only one critical clause negative, that on pre-release, which in the bill as originally drafted said that this had to be specifically distanced from the code, could not be included in the code, and would still essentially be decided by ministers. Now, there have been a number of things, measures announced by the government to mitigate this quite recently, and it is the one clause of the bill which is still being debated in Parliament. But on the whole, that's not too bad, is it? That looks quite good. So what are the key positive points for trust? Well, distancing of ministers, obviously, from what we've seen. And I think I like Clause 7, which regards the objectives of the board. And I'm just going to take a little while just to read some of that to you, because it says that the board is to have the objective of promoting and safeguarding the production and publication of official statistics that serve the public good. And serving the public good includes, in particular, informing the public about social and economic matters. Those of you who remember the Rayner principle by which official statistics were produced for government and the problems that caused will be glad to see that this is now definitively buried. And the serving the public good also includes assisting in the development and evaluation of public policy. And the board is to promote and safeguard the quality of official statistics, good practice, and the comprehensiveness of official statistics. Quality includes their impartiality, accuracy and relevance, and coherence with other statistics. And good practice includes assuring their accessibility. That's quite a nice clause. Of course, it's broad and wide-ranging, but then these clauses are. I think it's also positive that Parliament has a role to play. I've been very pleasantly surprised at the extent of interest that both MPs and Lords have taken in this issue as it's gone through Parliament. Pleasantly surprised because statistics is not generally something on which a lot of votes depend, but nevertheless there has been some very constructive debate. Obviously, in the Lords, we've had people like Lord Moser, but also a number of MPs in the Commons. I think it's perhaps worth mentioning Michael Fallon, who's the chair of the Treasury Subcommittee, which has sort of, in a sense, been, I suppose, in the committee with sort of responsibilities for looking at this procedure. And then, of course, the Code of Practice and provisions for assessment are obviously positive. What's negative? Well, we're losing the Statistics Commission, and it's obviously the system that will replace it is as yet untried. Continues the distinction over national versus other official statistics. I wonder if I could ask people, I'm not going to do a quiz quite like Simon's, but how many people among the audience who are not official statisticians themselves actually fully understand what the distinction is? Could I have hands up, please? Thank you. And how many people, just to make sure that the audience is not entirely official statisticians, how many people who are not official statisticians therefore don't understand? Okay, well, we've obviously got a lot of official statisticians in the audience, but clearly the majority is that people are not too sure about it. The unitary board is both the board of the ONS and, in a sense, a watchdog, and that could be a source of confusion. And then finally, we have to say the fact that pre-release is specifically excluded from the Code of Practice, although I have to say, in fairness, the government has announced measures that will reduce the access that ministers have to statistics before they are released to 24 hours. And I think this and one or two other measures are going to be positive. And as I said, this issue is still under debate. So let's sum up so far. There are issues of trust in statistics themselves, but there are probably greater problems with the use and the presentation and the perception of spin. It is generally agreed that trust problems are greater outside the ONS. And of course, this is, for example, data on crime, health, education, clearly very important for public perception. Recently, though, there are one or two concerns over the ONS, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. The new legislation is generally positive, but it is only a framework, and much will depend on the implementation. I'm now going to look at one or two specific issues. On the issue of release, there will be a publications hub to be set up for release of all national statistics. At the moment, of course, statistics not produced by the ONS are released generally by the department's press office, the same press office that is also responsible for putting the minister's point of view. And this, again, Simon touched on this point too, is not good. So a separate hub whereby which releases all national statistics will be good. We have yet to hear the details of how that's going to work. Pre-release is obviously seen as given an opportunity for spin, and as I mentioned this before, this will be reduced, I think, as a result of what's going on at the moment. A big issue, though, is the fragmentation of the UK statistical system. There are a lot of centrifugal forces that militate against proper coordination and coherence. First of all, we have 4 different nations in the UK. We can't change that. It's who we are. And for example, sometimes there are instances of different, for example, legal and educational systems in Scotland. But even putting the impact of these apart, there are still long-standing problems, and these predate devolution, but they've been made worse by devolution, into getting coherent statistics for the UK. We have a decentralised system of statistics in the UK where we don't have just one great body that produces everything. There are great advantages to this, not least of which the fact that statisticians can have some input into policy making, but there is the downside that it reduces coordination. And then we have statistics increasingly also compiled sometimes by agencies as well as by departments, and sometimes cascaded quite down. Health statistics, for example, are quite fragmented in this way. And finally, of course, the regional dispersion of offices of statistical offices generally under the government's drive to disperse more offices from London to the regions. So all of those are things that happen. We have to live with that, but it does mean you have to have a right balance between the individual needs and coordination in the centre, and that's going to be quite a difficult balance for the board to set. Now, I want to make it clear before I talk about this slide that I had written my presentation before I knew that Richard was going to be chairing this session. Chairs were only decided at the last minute. The Statistics Commission did have a bit of a shaky start, but it is now pretty widely respected, and it was interesting to see quite a number of comments acknowledging this by both MPs and Lords, which I think, and I don't think it's simply because Richard was heavily lunching them all. So we need to build on that. We need to make sure that the progress of the Statistics Commission has made is not lost and its expertise is retained. In particular, this is something users are concerned about, that the capability for research, it produces some excellent reports, has to be preserved, and that this transition to the new system has to be smooth. The Commission is, of course, itself doing a lot of preparatory work on that at the moment. As I mentioned, the confusion on national versus official statistics is inherently confusing, especially to lay users. Why can't you trust all official statistics? And there are a lot of anomalies. Quarterly hospital waiting lists are national statistics, monthly are not. The board will be able to initiate the process by which statistics are designated as national. That's a recent amendment to the bill. But ministers will also have an input into that. I think there could be some confusion over the roles, both of the board, its dual role, and of course the chair and the national statistician will have to work out how they are going to work together. Pressures on ONS. It's a pity that this is happening at the moment. ONS is facing very tough efficiency targets, losing 700 posts. That's huge. Modernisation of IT, challenges of the new legislation, and, again, the almost complete relocation out of London. There are a lot of concerns among users about the combined impact of all this, and there's a particular worry about, perhaps I'm looking at my own perspective as an economist here, about the impact of relocation on national accounts. National accounts is something that requires a lot of many years' experience before anyone becomes expert in it, and there's only one place you have that expertise, grow that expertise, and that's in the ONS. And at the moment, ONS is finding that only between 10 or 15% of posts that are moved to Newport actually move along with their post holder. So I think there's an obvious issue there that has to be properly managed. So what's going to be essential? Obviously the calibre of the board, the fact that they've got to listen to all users and increase the influence of government users, and ensure that mechanisms for producer-user dialogue are in place throughout. Some better assessment of needs of lay users and improving the access, and good communications with media and stakeholders, and indeed good PR, and I don't mean the dark arts of spin, but media are important. And I'm not just saying that because Simon's sitting there. And making the sense of national statistics. What will be essential also, coordinating the fragmented system, establishing good working relations between the board and the GSS staff, agreed division of responsibilities between the chair and national statistician, good release practices. Current ONS issues do have to be managed so they don't overshadow the start of the new system, and to build on the work of the Stats Commission. I realised when I was going through this last night that I think I've left one important point out of this, and that is that users also have to respond constructively. So to conclude, yes, the legislation has a lot of positive points. They're not quite perfect. Yes, I think it can provide a better framework for improving trust, but it won't automatically. And a lot will depend on how it's implemented. So that really is what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
It dawned on me looking over the slides on the way up on the train this morning that trust and confidence is quite an ambitious and quite a big title to be talking about. It sounds like a Russian novelist or Jane Austen or something like that. And I'd hope to demonstrate that level of insight. You'll be the judge of that. I won't ask questions on that at the end, though. I want to talk about three things in particular. I want to distinguish, first of all, between trust and confidence. I want to concentrate on the non-statutory, non-legislative ways of improving confidence. I won't talk in detail about the legislation itself. And I want to encourage a discussion about what more might be done, what more might we need to do between ourselves to improve confidence in statistics. Well, I won't labour this slide. We've heard repeatedly just how little confidence there is in UK official statistics, both from the opinion surveys of the modules we ran a couple of years ago, and in the more recent survey that Simon reported. That was then, that was a couple of years ago. It might well be that nothing has changed hugely in terms of confidence. But I wanted to pick up really on the middle point here about the bill and the genesis of it, which was the government's review it committed itself to back in 2000 of the framework for national statistics, which set out the roles and responsibilities of the key players. And it undertook that review in 2005. And shortly afterwards, the Chancellor announced his intention to legislate to make ONS independent of government, and so on. And that led through from the consultation process in March 2006 to the legislation that we see almost complete today. But my view, I think, is that the legislation is a necessary precondition to building trust and confidence. But also that it's not enough in itself. It's not sufficient. It's not a sufficient condition. So in other words, more needs to be done, I think, building on the provisions in the legislation to increase the likelihood that levels of trust and confidence can be improved. Well, earlier on, Jill introduced a new classification of users, and amongst friends, I'm sure I can introduce a new classification or new definitions of trust and confidence. The dictionary definitions, which obviously I looked up, aren't particularly helpful in this context, so I made a distinction that works for me. I'm talking about trust as matters of integrity, covering things like political interference. Now, Simon might have different experiences. In my experience, political interference is rare, but I would certainly agree that it's toxic in its poisoning of the system and people's views of it. And I consider confidence to be something different, and I'm thinking of it in terms of this presentation as being about the matters of professional competence and about the quality of the statistics. And I want to distinguish between trust and confidence, between integrity and quality concerns, because I think they're quite separate diseases, and I think they require quite different cures. Although, possibly labouring this analogy a little bit too much, I think there are some remedies, some solutions which would tend to improve both trust and confidence, and I'm thinking there things like better consultation with users and better statistical planning systems. Now, a key issue for us to address, and one I think that we need to address quite urgently, is whose approbation are we seeking in all of this? When we produce statistics, we know that by and large we're aiming to satisfy the needs of users. That's the fundamental point. But thinking about issues like trust and confidence, whose trust are we looking for? Who do we want to have confidence in the quality of our people and the quality of our statistics? Well, I think it's all the groups shown here: opinion formers, users, the media, and the public. It would be good to be in a position where the general public held a strong, positive view of official statistics. But two observations, really, I think. First of all, it's not possible, I don't think, to target the public directly. The public base their views on what they see in the media, and that in turn is influenced in part by opinion formers, parliamentarians, journalists, researchers, and so on. Now, it's a bit of a truism that opinion formers form opinions. Of course they do. That's why they're called opinion formers. But it's useful to bear in mind the fact that the public are getting their views, in a sense, second-hand, I think. A second observation is that some sections of the media and some opinion formers probably don't have neutral agendas. Some will find it easier to criticise official statistics than support official statistics, or at least not to give official statistics the benefit of the doubt. And some, I think it's fair to say, probably will tend to attack official statistics as a way of attacking the government. So all of this has got quite a lot of implications for our attempts to improve trust and confidence. So I'm going to focus really in this non-statutory perspective, thinking about the quality of the people, if you like, and the quality of the products. I'm going to focus on non-statutory initiatives from here on, and therefore, in terms of my definitions, looking at confidence. So many of the opinion formers have influenced the development of the legislation. And as Jill was saying before, the devil's in the detail now, the way it's implemented. But the most fundamental point to think is we need to have an idea of why it is that the distrusters or the lackers of confidence feel the way they do. In practice, we know that scepticism about statistics is hugely ingrained. The famous quotation by Disraeli, which I won't repeat, is a particularly well-known example. And we know, of course, that this sort of scepticism represents more general unease about government in some ways and about many other institutions of the state. But I think we can't simply throw our hands in the air and say that it's beyond our control. I think that wouldn't be responsible, and it certainly wouldn't be right. We know from the survey work that we've done to measure public confidence, and from related work by the Statistics Commission, by MORI on behalf of the Commission, that there are some things we can do better that would tend to improve public confidence, all else being equal. So I want to turn my attention now to a range of complementary non-statutory initiatives that I think would be likely to result in improved confidence. As you'll see from this slide, they're what I'd regard as soft issues. And the next few slides explain these in a bit more detail. These are beginning to flesh out what I think of as the medicine to address the various diseases. So first of all, and most importantly, we need to improve our communication, the infrastructure, the capability in our delivery. We need to improve the National Statistics website, as has been mentioned before, especially ways of searching it. And we're working on this at the moment, partly through our dissemination project, and at the same time through the development of the new publication hub that was referred to earlier, that will help users in that they will be able to obtain all national statistics from one central place. We also need to improve the quality and coherence of statistical releases. The hub is relevant here, and I think will be an excellent stimulus. But we need guidelines to help producers across the GSS provide appropriate commentary. We need to reduce the numbers of styles and formats used across the GSS, partly for its own sake, but also to signify the coherence that should be an integral part of the single statistical system that we have. And we should improve the communication of reliability as part of these efforts to improve coherence and quality. And thirdly here, we need to improve our communication skills. We should look at the competence framework for government statisticians and really rebalance that to a certain extent. Communication is increasingly important, and I'm not convinced that the competence framework we have, and therefore the way in which we recruit and train young statisticians and some of the older ones, is fully cognizant of the importance of communication. So, the second part of this is improving relationships and partnerships, where I think we need to take a number of steps. I think we need to engage more actively and systematically with opinion formers, because they, of course, influence potentially the reputation of official statistics with the public. And there's an important role there, I think, for the new Statistics Board. We also need to develop a better approach to user engagement in ONS and across the GSS so that our planning and prioritisation is better informed. I think there's probably an argument for establishing a high-level strategic partnership between producers and users and other key stakeholders. Jill mentioned before the producers and users group, where representatives of SUF get together with Karen Dunnell and some senior ONS people, and I think we can probably take that even further in order to deepen and broaden the type of thinking that the Statistics Board is exposed to. And I think it would be desirable to improve the statistical literacy of certain groups. The GSS might work with the RSS, for example, to help train journalism students. That might not only improve statistical literacy, but provide a real positive link between journalists and the people providing the figures. And again, I think government statisticians should improve their relationship management skills. I think the same points that I made about communication skills probably apply in respect of relationship management. We should also continue to modernise our range of products and services. We should, for example, I think, roll out the use of web nuggets across the GSS with all departments looking to produce them. We should be prepared to rework existing material for other users. One size doesn't fit all. If you've done a piece of analysis, it can be used in different ways. There's no loss of faith in doing that, I don't think. And we should encourage a culture of innovation. The personal inflation calculator, which we launched in ONS earlier this year, is a fine example, I think, of this sort of innovative work. And on this cultural point, I think we should be doing more to learn systematically from others, those in different organisations and institutions who've addressed head-on the issue of lack of trust or confidence. Maybe Ratner's jewellery might serve as an analogy. And from other national statistical institutes, some of whom also suffer, as we heard before, low levels of trust or confidence. And finally, we should resolve some of the branding issues we face in recent years. We need to develop and market brands around national statistics, hopefully addressing this national statistics, official or non-national statistics debate that's such a difficulty for us, and branding associated with the GSS itself. And I think in a similar vein, improve and standardise the service that users receive from the GSS. I think the perceptions of an organisation are formed very largely on the basis of the quality of the service experienced. A final substantive piece of medicine, I think, is managing quality more effectively. Now, I've deliberately not called this slide improving quality, because I don't think that improving quality is necessarily the answer, nor do I think it's necessarily achievable in an era of scarce resources and ever more demanding users. But instead, I think I tend to prefer to think about quality across the piece, across different statistical domains, and across the different dimensions of quality within a particular statistical product. So across domains, are we producing in the UK better statistics about agriculture than on the service economy? Should we be? How would we know? How might an interested observer, like the chair of the Statistics Board, be able to decide whether some rebalancing of quality, which in practice means some rebalancing of resources, might be appropriate? And for a given product, how do we decide whether to improve the relevance of a particular survey or introduce a new survey or product compared with improving the accuracy of something that we already have? If we've got a 95% response rate to a business survey, should we really be putting effort into chasing that remaining 5%? So there I'm talking about balancing quality. I think the new assessment and designation function, part of the work of the board, as we heard before, will be a tool to ensure that some of these questions are addressed in the context of looking at the compliance of statistics against the new code of practice. And I think this is all the more likely to happen if assessment type activity is conducted not only at the level of a detailed product, but also at a cross-cutting level, at a relatively strategic level, to help the board address its general objective of promoting and safeguarding the production and publication of official statistics that serve the public good. One final point on this slide, we need to take steps, I think, to improve our management of quality in ONS and the GSS, particularly in the strategic sense. In ONS, we're developing an updated quality management strategy at the moment, and I think this will probably place probably place greater emphasis on monitoring and using it to inform decision making more generally in ONS. It shouldn't be, I don't think, a standalone document. It should be something that becomes part of our culture. So in summary, to me, trust and confidence are related, but they're not the same. The new legislation is a necessary step in rebuilding trust and improving confidence, but is not sufficient. And our focus, I think, should be on these soft issues, implementing a culture change to improve communication and relationship management, and especially to improve, I've said, but manage, balance, quality. In order to achieve this focus, the GSS and in particular ONS, guided by the Statistics Board, need to provide determined and enlightened leadership